Jesus, this is like the fourth time I tried to film this. Hello. Recently, I asked one of my civilian friends if they knew what the phrase pushing something to the right meant, and they said no. Pushing something to the right just means that if you imagine things on a timeline, you take it from where it is and you push it to the right at a later time. Mind-blowing concept, I know, but it kind of highlighted that there are a lot of things that I say and do that are military related that I don't even realize are military related because I've just lived in this bubble since I was 18 years old. And this reminded me of the incredibly famous and very influential paper, I'm sure you're all very aware of it, The Risk Behind Communicating to People in Their Second Language During Hurricane Season. It goes into depth about how historically migrants to the United States who speak English as a second language typically respond differently to natural disaster warnings due to the differences in translation from English into their native language, referred to as the phenomena of linguistic relativity or Worfianism, although honestly that just kind of sounds like it would be some religion in a cheap fantasy novel. The paper continues by saying that this goes beyond simply the words we use, but also how we represent the warning data, both numerically and visually as well, and this leads to people not taking necessary precautions, resulting in these groups being disproportionately affected during a hurricane or tornado, for example. Here in the States, we use the word tornado and twister fairly interchangeably, and while tornado is still tornado in Spanish, twister more roughly translates to whirlwind, which doesn't really communicate something that can and will literally level an entire town. Hurricanes prove another problem as, depending on what part of the world they originate from, can be referred to as cyclones or typhoons, but depending on what language you translate those, it can mean things like flooding in Arabic, rainstorm in Persian, or even just dust storms in certain regions. Color coding can be a problem as well. If you show an American a radar image with lots of red and pink, they'll probably buckle down for some severe thunderstorms. But someone from a culture where red is more neutral and less alarming color, they might decide the storm is a perfect time to go try to run a few errands, only to end up as an amateur submariner half an hour later. The paper goes on about how languages need to be more inclusive to ensure equity, blah, 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 blah. This is my video, so I'm gonna make it about me. I feel like this just can be taken at a different level as well. The paper essentially focuses on language that conveys severity of situations and how different languages treat those things differently, or at least approach them from a different angle. Sometimes the word just doesn't even exist, much the same as the phrase pushing something to the right doesn't exist in civilian lexicon apparently. And if it does, let me know. The sample size on that was 1. As I've taken on this job now for a year and I've had to deal with less military-centric settings and more of a mixture between military and civilian, I'm kind of learning this new kind of language as well, and how certain things just do not translate over. In a strictly military setting, how people communicate is very straightforward and very obvious, and typically very blunt as well. And I've noticed that it's either wildly informal or severely overly formal depending on the civilian you talk to, and depending on the situation, of course. And in the military, depending on what level you're talking at, there is no corporate facade they have to work through like 90% of the time. You're polite to people, but not in the same way that you'd be polite to other people in a corporate setting, that you have to show that you're both playing the same game. I don't stress out if my boss says okay versus okay. I'm not worried if an email I send has the to box in descending order of precedence of seniority, but at the same time, I often find myself overthinking where I put the word sir in a sentence if I'm texting or emailing someone that outranks me. As a captain, I have to work through the intricacies of someone who is the same rank as me, but has a sense of seniority over me. And then, of course, the huge thing of managing relationships with the enlisted side of the house, especially when you have soldiers that are more experienced than you, have been in the Army longer than you've been alive, but still have to call you sir. Like, how on earth do you actually talk to that person? But now in my job, I'm dealing with a lot of civilians inside and outside of the university, depending on what we're doing. Of course, I've always had to deal with DoD civilians, but they're an entirely different breed of human being, so we're not even gonna touch those. I'm essentially having to learn this corporate language where different words have different levels of severity and meaning than what I'm used to. But I notice a lot of the time I tend to be overcorrecting. For example, if a military person gives me a deadline of a week, I will typically have it done a day or 2 prior. But if a civilian person gives me a deadline for a week, I'll just do it as soon as I possibly can, because I don't know if there's some coded message in what is expected if a deadline is a week from now. Again, overcorrecting probably, because I have no idea how things work in the real world. And all this just reminds me of the fact that this is the first time that I've lived away from a military base even since I was 18. I've essentially just lived in this little bubble my entire adult life. And of course, it all boils down to that weird civ-mil divide thing, that it happens, it exists. And now I find myself literally having to be my own translator from corporate talk from university people into things that I can translate into military speak to pass on to my other coworkers. Even little things like saying 2 p.m. versus 1400 or changing my email signature block, because who on earth knows what IEN, CPT means. All this really is just a big learning experience for me, which isn't a bad thing, but if you'll excuse me, I have to go to a university function now where we talk about our feelings.